I never wanted to leave home the way I did. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. A dramatic escape under the cover of night, my feet bleeding from running across broken glass and gravel, my breath heavy as I pushed myself through fields and over hills. I wasn't supposed to feel the fear that had lodged itself inside my chest like an iron nail, rusting with every painful heartbeat. And yet, that's exactly how my story began. At 16, I became the girl who vanished, the one they whispered about. My name is Emily Harper, and this is my story, a tale of revenge, justice, and the sweetness of becoming someone they never thought I could be. The small town of Carson Hill was where I had grown up. If you blinked, you'd miss it. One of those places where everyone knew everyone else, and secrets were rare, except the ones that mattered the most. My father was the mayor, a well-respected man, loved by the town, but not by me. He had a smile that charmed at social gatherings, his suit always pressed and neat, his voice always level. Behind closed doors, he was a different person. He was a tyrant, one whose love for control was only outmatched by his disdain for weakness. My mother was a quiet woman, the kind that melted into the wallpaper so you barely noticed she was there. I used to think she was just shy, but I learned with age that her silence was a kind of survival. She'd given up fighting long before I was even born. For me, survival meant running, because if I stayed, I'd have broken just like she had. I still remember her face that night, a strange mix of relief and fear. I didn't know if she wanted me to go or stay, but she didn't say anything, just stood at the door, watching me flee into the night. I ended up in the city, a different world from Carson Hill, with its concrete buildings, buzzing traffic, and anonymity. No one knew me, no one cared about me, and for a while, that's what I needed. I found a shelter, then a job waiting tables. It was hard, especially for a 16-year-old with no experience and no high school diploma, but I made do. I got by, and I learned things that the small town could never teach me: how to read people, how to blend in, how to survive in a world that didn't care whether I lived or died. Then there was him, Luca. He came into the diner one night, all dark eyes and leather jacket, the kind of guy mothers warned their daughters about. He looked at me like he saw past the uniform, the tired eyes, the fake smile. There was something about him that drew me in. Maybe it was the way he seemed out of place, just like me, or maybe it was the way he spoke to me, soft, like I mattered. Luca and I became close fast. He had his own past, one that was riddled with secrets and shadows. He didn't pry into mine, and I didn't pry into his. We were two broken people trying to make something work, trying to find solace in each other. And then one day, I told him. I told him about Carson Hill, about my father, about the night I left. Luca listened quietly, his eyes growing darker with every word. When I was done, he said nothing for a long time, and then he said, "You're going to make them pay for it, aren't you?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a truth that I had buried deep inside me but never dared speak aloud. Revenge. I had left to escape, but I had always known I would return. I wanted to see the look on my father's face when I walked back into Carson Hill, no longer the scared 16-year-old girl, but a woman who had nothing to lose. I wanted to see him squirm, to watch the town that had turned a blind eye to his cruelty see him for what he really was. Luca had connections. I didn't ask how or where they came from, but within weeks, he had a plan. He knew people who could help, people who had their own reasons for wanting to see a man like my father brought down. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice. For me, for my mother, for every person who had ever suffered under the hands of a man who thought he was untouchable. I returned to Carson Hill on a Tuesday morning. The sky was gray, heavy with the promise of rain. I drove a car I had bought with cash, wearing clothes that made me look like I belonged to a different world. No one recognized me at first. The people who had known me as a child passed by without a second glance, their faces blank, their minds preoccupied with their own small-town problems. I went to the diner, the only one in town, and sat at the counter, ordering a coffee. The waitress was new, someone who had moved in after I'd left. She smiled at me, and I smiled back, my heart pounding in my chest. It didn't take long for the news to spread. By noon, people were whispering. I saw them pointing, their eyes wide with disbelief. "Is that Emily Harper?" I heard one woman ask. Her voice hushed, as if saying my name aloud might summon some kind of ghost. I turned and met her eyes, giving her a small nod. She looked away quickly, her face turning red. By evening, my father knew I was back. I saw his car pull up in front of the diner, the sleek black vehicle that had always seemed so out of place in a town like Carson Hill. He stepped out, his face a mask of calm, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes darted around as if searching for something or someone. He walked into the diner, and for a moment, it was like time stopped. The room went silent, every eye turning to watch the scene unfold. "Emily," he said, his voice smooth, controlled. "What are you doing here?" I stood up slowly, taking my time. I wanted everyone to see this, to hear every word. "I came back," I said, my voice steady. "I came back to finish what you started." His eyes narrowed, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by me. "You should leave," he said, his voice dropping low, meant only for me. "You don't belong here anymore." I smiled then, a cold, hard smile. "Oh, I belong here more than you ever did, and I'm not going anywhere." The days that followed were a whirlwind. Luca arrived with his friends, people who knew how to dig up secrets, how to expose the truth. We started with the finances. My father had always been careful, but not careful enough. There were discrepancies, money that had disappeared, deals that had been made under the table. We found it all, and we made sure the right people saw it. The town that had once adored him began to turn, their trust eroding with every new piece of evidence we brought to light. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about the people he had hurt. My mother, the employees he had bullied, the families he had destroyed in his quest for power. We gave them a voice, a platform to speak out. It was slow at first, but once one person came forward, others followed. The dam broke, and the flood of stories was unstoppable. My father tried to fight back, tried to discredit me, to paint me as the troubled daughter who had run away. But it didn't work. The town had seen too much, heard too much. They couldn't ignore the truth anymore. And then, there was my mother. She had been silent for so long, but when she finally spoke, it was like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She stood up in front of everyone, her voice trembling but clear, and she told them what he had done to her, to me, to our family. It was the end of him. The man who had once been the most powerful person in Carson Hill was reduced to nothing. The town turned its back on him, and he had no choice but to leave, disgraced, defeated. I watched him drive away, the same car that had brought him to the diner that first day. He didn't look back, and neither did I. Luca stood beside me, his hand slipping into mine. "You did it," he said, his voice soft. I nodded, a sense of peace washing over me. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about closure, about finally being free. I had come back to Carson Hill to face my past, to confront the demons that had haunted me for so long. And now, as I stood there, watching the sunset over the town, I knew that I had done just that. I had been forced to leave home as a teenager, but look where I was now, stronger, unbroken, and finally, truly free. It had been 3 years since my father drove out of Carson Hill. 3 years since I watched him leave, a hollow man stripped of his power and pride. Life had moved on, and so had I, or at least, I thought I had. The town changed too, slower than I'd hoped, but change was happening. My mother and I were closer than ever, working together to rebuild the lives we had once lost. She had finally left the old house, and together we found her a small cottage on the outskirts of town, a place filled with sunlight and laughter, something I'd never seen her experience before. And then there was Luca. He stayed. He wasn't the type to settle down, but somehow, for me, he made it work. We rented a small apartment above an old bookstore, a place that smelled like parchment and stories waiting to be told. Luca found work as a mechanic, and I got my GED, then started taking classes at the community college. I wanted to be a social worker. I knew what it was like to be invisible, to feel like no one cared, and I wanted to be the person I had once needed. Things were good. They were stable. But as life has a way of doing, everything changed when I least expected it. It began with a phone call. It was late, and Luca had just returned from work, his hands still stained with engine oil. I was cooking dinner, something simple, pasta and sauce. The phone rang, and I answered without thinking. "Hello?" There was silence on the other end, a heavy, almost expectant silence. I frowned, about to hang up when a voice crackled through, one I hadn't heard in years. Emily. I froze, the world narrowing to that single, awful sound. It was him, my father. My stomach twisted, my hands trembling as I gripped the phone tighter. "What do you want?" I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need your help," he said. The arrogance that had once colored his every word was gone, replaced by something else. Fear. "Please, Emily, I have nowhere else to go." I should have hung up. I should have slammed the phone down and forgotten he ever called. But there was something in his voice, something that caught my attention. He was scared. The man who had once terrified me was now terrified himself, and I wanted to know why. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him. Luca wasn't happy about it, and I didn't blame him. He argued with me, his voice rising in frustration. "He doesn't deserve your help, Em. He's a snake, and you know it. He'll drag you down with him." But it wasn't about helping him. It was about answers. Answers that I had never gotten. Answers that I wasn't sure I even wanted. The curiosity burned within me, and despite everything, I needed to see him one last time. The next day, I drove out to meet him. He had given me an address, a rundown motel on the edge of town, the kind of place where no one asked questions and people came to disappear. I parked the car and walked up to the room number he'd given me, my heart pounding in my chest. I knocked, and after a moment, the door opened. My father looked nothing like the man I remembered. He was thinner, his hair grayer, his face lined with exhaustion. His eyes, once sharp and cold, were dull, filled with a kind of desperation that made my heart ache despite everything. He stepped aside, letting me in, and closed the door behind me. "You look different," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You look the same," I lied. I wanted to hurt him, just a little, to make him feel the way I had felt for so many years. But the words came out weak, lacking the venom I intended. He sank into a chair, his shoulders slumping. "I made mistakes," he said, his voice cracking. "I thought I could control everything, that I was invincible. But I'm not. I've lost everything, Emily. Everything. And now—" He trailed off, his eyes darting to the window as if he expected someone to burst through it at any moment. "Why did you call me?" I asked, my voice hardening. "After everything you did, why now?" He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Because I have no one else. And because—" He hesitated, then looked me in the eyes, and for the first time, I saw something real there. "Because someone is after me. They want me dead, Emily, and I think it's because of what happened in Carson Hill." A chill ran down my spine. I had thought it was over. I had thought that by exposing him, by bringing his crimes to light, I had ended it. But now, looking at him, I realized that the past had a way of coming back, no matter how far you ran or how much you thought you had changed. "Who?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He shook his head. "I don't know. I've been getting threats, letters, and then—" He lifted his shirt, revealing a bruise along his ribs, dark and ugly. "They came after me. They said they'd finish what you started." My heart twisted, guilt and fear mingling in my chest. I had wanted revenge, but I hadn't wanted this. I hadn't wanted him dead, just gone. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. "Why should I help you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "After everything you did, why should I care if they come for you?" He didn't answer at first, just looked at me with those hollow eyes. "Because you're my daughter," he said finally, "and because, despite everything, I'm still your father." I wanted to laugh, to scream, to tell him that he wasn't my father, that he had lost that right the day I ran away, but the words wouldn't come. I looked at him, this broken man who had once seemed so invincible, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Pity. I stood up, my hands shaking. "I'll think about it," I said, turning towards the door. "Emily," he called out, his voice raw. "Please, don't leave me." I paused, my hand on the doorknob. I didn't look back, didn't trust myself to. "I'll let you know," I said, and then I walked out, the door clicking shut behind me. The drive home was a blur, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. Luca was right, my father was a snake, and getting involved would only drag me back into the darkness I had fought so hard to escape. But there was something else, too. a nagging feeling that wouldn't leave me alone. If someone was after my father, if they were trying to finish what I had started, then maybe they would come for me too. I pulled into the driveway of our apartment, my hands still trembling as I shut off the engine. Luca was waiting for me at the door, his expression tense. He didn't say anything as I walked up to him, just pulled me into his arms, holding me tight. I closed my eyes, leaning into him, trying to steady my breathing. "What happened?" he asked after a moment, his voice soft. "He's in trouble," I said, my voice muffled against his chest. "And I think we might be too." Luca pulled back, his eyes searching mine. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath, trying to find the words. "Someone's after him, and they might be coming for us too." He was silent for a long moment, his jaw clenching. "Then we fight," he said finally, his voice steady. "We're not running this time, Em. Not anymore." I nodded, a strange sense of calm washing over me. I had spent so long running, so long hiding from the past. But now, it seemed, the past had found me, and there was only one thing left to do: face it head on. Whatever was coming, whatever danger lay ahead, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't that scared 16-year-old girl anymore. I was stronger, and I had people who cared about me, people who would fight beside me. And this time, I wouldn't back down. This time, I would finish what I had started.